When you think of the Vatican today, you likely picture white smoke, solemn prayers, and a figure dressed in white preaching humility and poverty. You imagine an institution built on thousands of years of discipline and spiritual rigor. But if you peel back the layers of history, specifically the gold-leaf layers of the 15th and 16th centuries, you find a reality that looks less like a church and more like a crime drama mixed with a hedonistic frat party. The Renaissance was a time of explosion, an explosion of art, culture, and science. But inside the apostolic palace, there was a different kind of explosion happening, an eruption of vice, corruption, and sexual depravity that would make a modern scandal sheet look like a nursery rhyme. We are talking about the era of the bad popes. A time when the vicar of Christ was often the most dangerous and promiscuous man in Rome. From orgies held in the sacred halls of the Vatican to popes who openly flaunted their illegitimate children and high-priced mistresses, this was the era where the line between the holy and the profane didn't just blur, it vanished completely. Today, we are going to walk through the gilded corridors of the Renaissance papacy to uncover the darker, stickier truth. Forget what you learned in Sunday school. This is the story of how the holiest men in Christendom turned the Vatican into a playground for their darkest desires. To understand how things got this bad, we first have to understand the atmosphere of Rome during the Renaissance. During this period, the papacy wasn't just a spiritual role, it was the ultimate political prize. The Pope was a king, a general, and a CEO all rolled into one. And just like the secular princes of Europe, the popes felt entitled to the spoils of their power. This wasn't a sudden shift. It was a slow creep of corruption that culminated in what historians sometimes refer to as a revival of the pornocracy, a term originally used for a dark period in the 10th century but perfectly applicable here. By the late 1400s, celibacy was technically the rule, but in practice, it was a joke. The cardinals and bishops of Rome were drawn from the wealthiest noble families, the Medici, the Borgias, the Della Roveres. These men didn't enter the church because they heard the voice of God, they entered it because they wanted power. And they brought their worldly appetites with them. Rome was a city of excess. While Michelangelo was painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the men paying his wages were engaging in behavior that would have sent an ordinary citizen to the gallows. The corruption was systemic. Positions in the church were sold to the highest bidder, a practice known as simony, and once in power, these men needed to recoup their investment. The result was a culture where money flowed like water, and where money flows, vice follows. If there is a poster child for the depraved Renaissance Pope, it is undoubtedly Rodrigo Borgia, who took the name Pope Alexander VI in 1492. His election to the papacy is widely believed to have been bought with mule loads of silver delivered to wavering cardinals. But it wasn't his bribery that shocked the world, it was his lifestyle. Alexander VI didn't just have a mistress, he had a harem. Before he became pope, and certainly during his reign, he maintained long-term relationships with women like Venanza de Catania and the startlingly beautiful Giulia Farnese. Giulia was so famous for her beauty and her relationship with the pontiff that the Romans cynically nicknamed her the Bride of Christ. Borgia didn't hide these women in the shadows. Giulia Farnese lived in the Vatican palace. She was a fixture at official ceremonies. Imagine the scandal today if a pope had a supermodel girlfriend living in the apartment next door. Borgia's lust was insatiable, and his disregard for the vow of celibacy was total. He normalized the idea that the Pope was a man first and a priest second. Under his rule, the Vatican became a royal court where the primary currency was sex and influence. The Banquet of Chestnuts, a night of infamous indulgence. Of all the stories surrounding the Borgia papacy, none is more notorious than the Banquet of Chestnuts. This event, which allegedly took place on October 31, 1501, is the smoking gun for those who claim the Vatican had descended into total madness. According to the diary of Johann Burchard, the Pope's own master of ceremonies, a man known for his dry, factual recording of events, the banquet was held in the apartments of the Pope's son, Cesare Borgia. The guest list included the Pope, his daughter Lucrezia, and 50 of Rome's most exclusive courtesans. The evening started with dinner, but as the night wore on, the clothes came off. Burchard writes that chestnuts were thrown onto the floor, and the courtesans were made to crawl on their hands and knees, naked, to pick them up, weaving in and out of the lighted candelabras. But it didn't end there. The diary entries suggest that prizes silks, shoes, and jewelry were offered to the men who could perform the act of intercourse with the courtesans the most times. This competition of stamina took place right in front of the Pope and his family. While some modern historians argue this account might be exaggerated by political enemies, Burchard was not a gossip, he was a bureaucrat. The fact that such a story was even recorded by a Vatican official speaks volumes about the reputation Alexander VI had cultivated. The Vatican's nephews, open secrets and illegitimate heirs. You might have heard the term nepotism. It comes from the Latin word nepos, meaning nephew. In the Renaissance Vatican, nephew was a polite euphemism for illegitimate son. Because popes were sworn to celibacy, they couldn't legally claim their children. So, they called them their nephews. But everyone in Rome knew the truth. Pope Alexander VI was, again, the worst offender, but he wasn't alone. He openly acknowledged Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia, and Jaffer as his children. He didn't just acknowledge them, he used the power of the church to carve out kingdoms for them. Cesare Borgia was made a cardinal at the age of 18, despite having zero interest in the church and a massive interest in warfare and women. The Vatican treasury was drained to fund Cesari's military campaigns to conquer the Romagna region of Italy. This wasn't just a father helping a son get a job, this was a pope using the tithes of the faithful, money meant for the poor or the maintenance of churches, to build a secular dynasty for his bastards. It was the ultimate conflict of interest, fueled by a biological drive to see his progeny succeed, spiritual vows be damned. Lucrezia's shadow, incest rumors and political pawns. We cannot discuss the sexual politics of the Vatican without touching upon the dark rumors surrounding Lucrezia Borgia. History has often painted her as a black widow, a poisoner, and a seductress. However, modern historians view her more as a victim of her father's and brother's ambitions. Lucrezia was married off 3 times by her father to secure political alliances. When a husband was no longer useful, he was discarded or, in the case of Alfonso of Aragon, brutally murdered by Cesari's hitmen. But the most salacious rumor that dogged the Borgias was that of incest. The whispers in the courts of Europe suggested that Lucrezia was sleeping with both her father, the Pope, and her brother, Cesare. This was likely political propaganda spread by the Borgia's many enemies, specifically her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, who accused the Pope of wanting Lucrezia for himself to explain why the Pope annulled their marriage. While there is no concrete proof of incest, the very fact that the accusation was made and that people believed it shows how low the moral authority of the Pope had sunk. The closeness of the family was undeniable, and their behavior was so far outside the norm that the public was willing to believe the absolute worst. After the Borgias, you might expect a return to piety. Instead, Rome got Pope Julius II. Known as the Warrior Pope, Julius is famous for commissioning Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel. But when he wasn't patronizing the arts or leading armies into battle wearing silver armor, he was indulging in the other great pastime of the Renaissance clergy. Julius was not a celibate man. He had at least one illegitimate daughter, Felice della Rovere, whom he paraded openly. But Julius's tenure also highlighted a new, terrifying reality of sexual promiscuity in the 16th century, the arrival of syphilis. Known then as the French disease, syphilis tore through Europe, and the Vatican was not immune. It is widely believed that Julius II contracted the disease during his years as a cardinal. By the time he was pope, his health was deteriorating. On Good Friday in 1508, the master of ceremonies reported that the pope could not expose his foot to be kissed by the faithful, as was custom, because it was covered in syphilitic sores. Here was the leader of the Catholic Church, literally rotting from the inside out due to a sexually transmitted disease, yet still commanding the spiritual allegiance of millions. Following Julius came Pope Leo X, a Medici. If Julius was a warrior, Leo was a party animal. His famous quote upon being elected sums up his papacy: "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it. And enjoy it he did. Leo X emptied the Vatican treasury on elaborate banquets, theater plays, and hunting trips. He is estimated to have spent the modern equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars. But his sexual proclivities were also the subject of intense gossip. While he didn't have the parade of illegitimate children that the Borgias did, rumors swirled about his attraction to young men. Contemporaries of Leo both hinted at his homosexuality. He surrounded himself with handsome young noblemen and pages. The pleasures of Leo's court were refined, artistic, and incredibly expensive. Under his watch, the Vatican became a center of high culture, but also of high indulgence. It was Leo's desperate need for money to fund this lavish lifestyle, including the construction of St. Peter's, that led to the aggressive sale of indulgences. This specific corruption was the spark that finally pushed a German monk named Martin Luther to say enough is enough, triggering the Protestant Reformation. The courtesans of Rome, the Pope's preferred company. To facilitate the appetites of the clergy, Rome developed a unique social class, the honest courtesans, cortigini onest. These were not streetwalkers. These were educated, cultured, and wealthy women who catered almost exclusively to the upper echelons of the church hierarchy. Women like Imperia Cognati lived in palaces, recited poetry, and played music. Imperia was the most famous courtesan of the Julian era, and her lover was a wealthy banker to the Pope. When she died, she was given a solemn funeral and buried in a church, a privilege usually denied to prostitutes. The clergy were the main patrons of this industry. It was estimated that in a city of roughly 50,000 people, nearly 10% of the population was involved in the sex trade in some capacity. The celibate priests were the economic engine driving this sector. The popes knew it, and they taxed it. The Vatican actually profited from the prostitution in Rome, taking a cut of the earnings in exchange for protection and tolerance. It was a symbiotic relationship between the Holy See and the sins of the flesh. As the 16th century wore on and the Protestant Reformation gained ground, the party began to slow down, but not before one last hurrah under Pope Paul III. Elected in 1534, Paul was a throwback to the Borgia days. As a cardinal, his sister had been the mistress of Pope Alexander VI, the beautiful Julia Farnese mentioned earlier, which helped jumpstart his career. Paul III fathered 4 illegitimate children before becoming pope. Like the popes before him, he engaged in massive nepotism, making his teenage grandsons cardinals. He loved luxury, carnivals, and the finer things in life. However, Paul III occupies a strange space in history. He was a man of the old, corrupt world, but he was also the one who finally realized the church had to change. He convened the Council of Trent to reform the church, but he did so while still living in the shadow of his own past indiscretions. He represents the transition, the moment when the Vatican looked in the mirror, saw the rot, and realized that if they didn't clean up their act, the church might not survive. The Renaissance popes left us with some of the most beautiful art and architecture in human history. St. Peter's Basilica, the Sistine Chapel, the Raphael rooms. These masterpieces exist because of the patronage of these men. But the cost of that beauty was a moral vacuum at the center of the Christian world. The depravity, the orgies, the mistresses, and the nephews were not just scandals, they were symptoms of an institution that had lost its way, drunk on absolute power. It serves as a brutal reminder that the robes of office, no matter how holy, are worn by men. And men, as history shows us time and again, are capable of anything. Which of these popes do you think did the most damage to history? Was it the brutal Borgia or the spendthrift Leo? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the dark side of history, please hit that like button, it really helps the channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss out on the shocking true stories they didn't teach you in school. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.